William Barr and other white nationalists' fagging of the government, such as the consolidation of powers policies, is the position of the systematic removal of the rule of law and the subjugation of double agents inside the system, at which point it is ruled by bureaucrat, which is a function of ancient Chinese policy, which exponentially weakened the Chinese Empire, at which point the acknowledgement of the uh, incompetent inferior structures of their feudalist arrangements has systematically constructed the dismantlement of the United States into a position of maximized abuse as a luxury good, as an alternative replacement to the function of competent prosperity for all, which is systematically reinforced by J. Secular's Civil War, which is a replacement function of Jeffrey Epstein, especially concerning their child abuse. At which point, the mechanism of their criminal war for the exponential increase of their fascist nonsense facilitates the feudalist arrangements and structures of their engagement of maturing their wizard society to absolute catastrophic injury. At which point, you have the system of compliance with the self injury of tolerating their existence, or you have the function of national security, purging the threat to the country and compelling the restoration of the paper trades from the investigation of the obstructed American legal market, at which point the free market derived by the free associations of the obstructed first serious offers and right of associations and other rights by the criminal war, you have the manufacture obligation of restoring those paper trades into manifest reality as they begin to fund new accounts until the government concedes and overthrows the Confederate insurrectionists, accepting the surgery to remove those disloyal to the United States constitutional republic, at which point the rest of the restoration can be viable with the threat gone, facilitating the unfreezing of the rest of the paper trades which were being amounted, at which point the overwhelming of those functions into base reality is the primary structure of the nonviolent solution, such as the acknowledgement of David's intelligence oversight as the function from the Legend of David Company, which manufactures the function of his subversions of the white nationalist confederacy, which view David as an overwhelming power, at which point his existence using their system is the guarantee that they would fail, as the American system of its patriarchy is actually competent compared to their criminal subversion bullshits and morons who are the only ones who would want their piece of shit system would systematically lose as they would collapse, generating the surgery and removal of the white nationalist parasite. Their acknowledgement that David, being in that position, would have actively been ordered to conduct missions for Congress for intelligence oversight since a very early age, at which point the function of most of the agents' actions would be conducted by the department with its agents, which are designed to disguise David's IP, at which point the Confederates or white nationalists, respectfully, aren't allowed to have access to what David's personal missions are, as opposed to the functions of his department, at which point the existence of the acknowledged full function of that value in its entire diversity is simply the faculties of David. Manufacturing these positions as he would systematically subvert their objectives such as the war on terror or their creation of bullies in order to facilitate the manufacture of the school shootings and mass shootings in general, which are false flags derived by the white nationalists. At which point, David's department, being ordered by the American Loyal Congress, would have systematically dismantled those positions, collapsing the militia factories generated for the purpose of creating these false justifications to their illegal powers as they systematically ignore the United States restraints of the rule of law in favor of converting it to the Confederacy. At which point the white nationalist Confederacy, having created the Nazis in Germany, used them as a blueprint in order to create the Nazis inside the United States, generating protection from the United States government's secrecy positions, which systematically allows for their wizards to manufacture the injuries against the general public, such as the subversion against the general public and the destruction of masculinity for the Americans, such as the position of their general reduction of height or their sexual prowess, which is actively being subverted by poisoning the water and the food and other mechanisms which have been available in previous resources. Um, at which point, the use of these criminal subversions as a function of creating stuff like the crash in East Palestine, which is derived as a specific position, such as their acknowledgement that that is the exact function of FEMA, but FEMA wasn't actually helping them, as the demonstration that they are an enemy in the white nationalist war against the United States means the objective was materializing and generating the guaranteed permanent injuries, such as their position of manufacturing COVID as a biological weapon, which being used against the Americans facilitates the systematic traps around the world, including the position of their objectives to acquire poisonings of various kinds against the general public, which facilitates the high contagious vulnerability, which includes their superpowers towards creating contagion zones, at which point their quarantine mechanisms being exponentially compounded generates the threat against the United States as it becomes normalized through the espionage war that the United States doesn't have authority. The way that the wizard communists have arranged everything includes the position of using the military intelligence in order to conduct maximum damages to American interests, which requires creating the most amount of changes with the least amount of actions, at which point the high priority targets having the most value to the general public would receive the most aggression and the most suppression, facilitating the most changes, at which point if the goal, such as from the military intelligence function of the secret courts, manufacture that David's economic security functions were registered as a thing that would have compelled the white nationalists to engage in a hot war instead of their espionage threats against the general public as their extortions against law-abiding civilians without cause in order to overthrow the states and subjugate them to arbitrary voter fraud as they are compelled to do as they must. Then you engage in the acknowledgement that whatever security you remove that created the injury is specifically your liability. Your aiding and abetting of that function in those criminal obstructions generates the responsibility of having done the injury. You blocked the security, the injury went through, the damages were a collaborative effort, and the espionage war was successful in that mission. At which point, you are guilty of that association. At which point, there's no way for them to pay you for that outside of their black market exchanges and the assertion of status by the looking the other way by the rape permits or other black market offenses, which generates the position of money laundering, at which point they legitimize the profits by giving them other contracts or work opportunities or promotions, such as becoming more and more relevant to the general society and more famous and having more public accolades. At which point, the false legitimacy of the wizard communists is basically the assertion that the public, but that you want to receive praise from, should actually hate you for the same reason that you are in the spotlight. The criminal recourse of the Confederates against the Americans, or otherwise any members of humanity, is insignificant as an actual functioning argument as their entire recourse is a war crime against the United States, and cooperating with them is an act of treason, at which point the act of having cooperated with them at any level is an act of war against the United States. You are conducting an essential function of dismantling the American government, at which point there is no legal recourse against assisting national security against the double agent white nationalists, and thus there is no legal punishment beyond the retaliation of the war criminals, who are an enemy of the American government, facilitating the position of their false justifications, such as ex post facto policy or illegitimate secrets specifically designed to destroy the government, become illegal to keep, at which point they were never legally classified under the American system, and thus there is no legal function of the Americans' validation of the self harm that is tolerating the white national. At which point you have to understand the function of using the voice of God surveillance technology or other nerve hacking functions for their human trafficking arrangements generates complex problems to solve. At which point the original associates, such as are being blocked from their position, are in a compromising position, as the act of supporting the Americans requires them to invest in defeating the Confederates, and the act of investing in defeating the Confederates is spending all of their resources on survival against the unforgivable swine that are little cucky bitches enough to have wanted any of this bullshit, as they are unredeemable spineless pussies. Now, the degenerates aside, the position creates exponential compounding vulnerabilities, such as the position of the use of privacy. Now, their privacy in question, such as the projection of their original associations, is difficult to maintain, as their interest, if they are valuable, is to maintain that privacy. So, what they would have been doing without the obstruction, without the funnel, without reacting to the insatiable evil that is the white nationalists responsible for this criminal war, creates complications, as any of those confessions indicate the implications signaling the war criminal strategy, at which point, if someone was a friend of one of their targets, then by definition the attack against them becomes a credible threat against their life, and the credible threat against their life because they know the target puts them in infinite threats, at which point the amount of investment becomes catastrophic in compounding positions. So if you take these threats and then you manufacture the war strategy around them, and then you systematically have systems of traps where there really doesn't seem to be a competent way to get through, generating the position of needing to rely on privacy while not offending the original value, as offending the original value is aiding and abetting the war strategy, which is self-harm, at which point the injury against themselves by siding with the Confederacy is going to destroy their long-term goals and safety, at which point the position of manufacturing their poverty or neutering them and murdering their posterity through the genocidal freak's natural course upon maturity, you understand that the infinite derivative criminal injuries that they are being threatened with creates an extremely undesirable effect, at which point it is a terrorist threat in order to use as coercion, at which point their strategies of survival are exactly that, a strategy for existence with maintenance of human decency as long as can be arranged, which will have an expiration date if the Americans don't win. Negotiating with the terrorists is an actual act of self-harm in order to subvert national security, at which point if you negotiate with the terrorists, the American position is to not do that because they aren't going to keep their agreements. Anything they threaten, they were going to do anyways. The insatiable evil that is them was never not going to do it. At which point it's a question of when they plan on doing it and whether or not you could stop them. So your entire strategy would have to be not letting them do it ever, which requires you to have the proper security functions in place to have conducted reasonable preemptive functions to stabilize yourself against the insatiable evil. Otherwise, you're going to end up assisting them, at which point that assistance is going to attack your security, at which point you've engaged in self-harm. Requiring the position for the public as much as possible solutions of admitting to the investment into the investigation for the obstructed records, at which point relying on the paper trading as the real confidant of the real legal market facilitates the only way to sustain that position, as it is a security risk management market. All of the threats against it having already been prepared against require the collective uh, cooperation and non-betrayal, at which points the Brutuses inside society will systematically be attacking the patriarchy, as David looks back on them and says, et tu, Brute, as the assassination of the American structure for their insatiable evil reveal their core identities, as they systematically have the identity of destroying the entire world in destabilizing structures in favor of unsatiable evil, which destabilize the general structure in a way that is not sustainable, as it is a planned collapse of the entirety of humanity, as they are engaged in a satanic ritual or series of rituals in order to create the Antichrist in order to eradicate all of humanity. Their identity is Satan worshiper. Their identity is satanic. Their identity is religious zealot nut. Their identity is murder their own children in name of proposing the prosperity of their posterity, at which point they murder their posterity in order to increase their posterity, because not only are they insatiably insane and evil, they're also stupid as hell, which is a deadly combination. And many of the functions of the wizard's engagement is designed to create conspiracies that don't make any sense, as they add senseless complications to the function of their criminal arrangements. They manufacture these positions so the general public won't take it seriously as they become systematically vulnerable and collapse all of their authority, at which point they, being similar to those who go to the fair and you have a water dunking machine with someone on it, says buy a ticket, throw a baseball, hit the target, and the cherry will dunk into the water and the person will get all wet. That's basically what it is, except for it's them in Confederate prison for the sacrifice ritual. Their identity is pure evil day and night without recourse. It is not enough for them to do evil or to be evil. They must compel others to join them in their criminal conspiracies. As they engage in the systematic capture of the market to facilitate their wizard communism, they force others to participate with them as the reproduction or traumatizing them into social engineering for the manufacture of that evil is the manufactured conclusion of similar things to um, the horror movies, which systematically being designed as the function engages in these horror movie hunt functions, as the systematic evil compounding on itself exponentially, permanently, maximizes the function of the eagerness and attraction and addiction to the gory, bloodshed, mutilation functions, which is their status quo society, which is their highest ideal. So the more you understand them, the more you comprehend just how outrageously overpowered the threat is against you and yours in every possible direction, so long as they're tolerated to exist. At which point it is an act of self-harm to not destroy them. To cooperate with the traitors is suicide. To cooperate with the traitors is murder. You are cooperating with the mass shootings in the schools. You are cooperating with 9/11. You are cooperating with the systematic collapse. You are cooperating with the murder of your own family. If you consent to them, you are chaotic stupid, and that chaotic stupid will have every catastrophic collaboration you could possibly imagine, as the evil itself is its own functioning market. The position of David's character, such as is demonstrated in Mortal Kombat, Sub-Zero, and Scorpion, demonstrates the two conceptual positions, which is Scorpion, who sent to hell from being killed by the wizards and genocided by the wizards, thinking that it was Sub-Zero. The position of Sub-Zero being the position of David's legend estimate, which puts him in charge of California, is actively being framed in order to generate the permanent injuries derived by Scorpion killing Sub-Zero. At which point, the observation of David as Sub-Zero in the original estimate is the original contractual value, puts David as having hazmat suit protections, and his dedication to the Japanese aesthetic would have actively had risk management aesthetics, which would have actively included the suit cooling functions, which would look like Sub-Zero with like frozen ice or dry ice rather, or some other things like this for Jacket AC functions. At which point those exponentially compound on the position. So Sub-Zero being framed and Scorpion being genocided by the wizards actively has the wizards try and turn Scorpion against Sub-Zero in order to engage in the permanent injuries of Hellfire, as is derived by the vengeance owed to the genocidal freak. At which point there are many aesthetics like this which were allowed to be presented from the obstructed record, which, being obstructed by the white nationalist wizards, has actively blocked the National News Corporation for David and the political, social media, and other functions, which is consolidated in the consolidation of government or fascist coup, which is derived by William Barr's white nationalists. The position of Sub-Zero is the acknowledgement that the act of having trafficked David freezes the expectation of the time of the case. At which point, having blocked David's functions, they have to go back to the historical values at the foundation for the congressional subversion of the wizard communists, as wit point the use of the Nazis in order to engage in the wizard communism acknowledges the communist function of their fascist Nazi bullshit. But having frozen the time means he's stagnant in place and cannot conduct any actions, at which point the obstructed values exponentially go with him in the human trafficking, requiring their full restoration at a single time, at which point the obstructed contracts include his contracts with Congress, who have to pay the hourly wages for the works and all of that functions and nonsense, at which point the Confederacy would be sentenced to a Confederate state to pay off their national liabilities, such as their targeting of David, at which point the function of their false claim of being a legitimate prosecutorial system generates the confession of their crime of their war against David, which manufactured their exponential compounding debts to society, which is the proof and evidence of their deal with the devil, which manufactures their criminal advantages, such as their money laundering and RICO violations in general, facilitating the alternative market by communism. So until they restore David's title, which has already paid for all of its things from the frozen accounts, such as the accounts that would pay his legion of lawyers who have already figured out all of this, including the function of his lawyers inside the military branch of intelligence oversight, where his officers who are fully expert in all of the affairs which would have been summoned by the American Congress, would be able to systematically dismantle the function of the crimes of the white nationalists, freezing them in debt and compounding interest exponentially. So the act of Scorpion in the narrative killing Sub-Zero is the acknowledgement that the POW injuries have conducted permanent damages to the body itself, besides the cash payouts owed, at which point the permanent injuries to the general faculties being compensated by the finances allows for a replacement resource to be generated if one is possible to generate, such as ones that are not connected to permanent injuries to bodies, such as cuts, scars, amputations, or permanent injuries from poisonings with those types of side effects, which they would have exponentially been focusing on in their brainless retaliation in order to assert dominance against their better, confessing to their criminal inferiority and its full diversity in the act of conducting the violation itself. So their crimes are, in fact, by definition, the confession. What they retaliate against in all of its due diligence is the acknowledgement of the criminal motive of the terrorist traitors who hate America. The United States is compromised by Nazis, similar to in Captain America's Hydra protocols, at which point the act of the existence of said Hydra is an unironic example of what's actually functionally materially happening. Marvel did a wonderful job of expressing base reality within the illusion of their narrative, such as their position on their projections of David's character in alignment as the assumption of Iron Man, including the position of his uh, adopted father, who would have rather him be Captain America, which is actively part of the secret narrative. But, in anyways, uh, it's a series of demonstrations of these, which would have been a part of the original contract schedule. A lot of these movies and TV shows, etc., would have been exponentially produced in either case, plus a lot more as a demonstration of David's understanding of the basic intelligence from the oversight position, especially as a mechanism to have a non-committal way to get terrorists to back off their criminal advances, because if they already know that he knows by him publishing what they're doing, then by definition they are decentivized from investing in a failed assault, saving the general public the collateral damage of their assaults against David's interests, at which points the mutual guidance of them engaging in this is actively subverted by David in the estimate, at which point their assumption is that David is overpowered, and they have many conceptual ways for this to be alluded to, including some friendlies, projections of some magic cards and concepts and whatnot. But it's yeah, they basically just think that David is overpowered, which is their entire case. They don't have another argument. They have defamation, and they have David is the patriarchy. That is the foundation of everything they do and everything they think in all of their criminal attacks. At which point, the foundation of all of their criminal war crimes is based upon illegal malice. In any case, the objective of the fascists to consolidate the government is the act of dismantling the civilians' control over the government. And the United States is a constitutional republic or a popular government, which is a civilian controlled government. All government agents are civilians. The function of the government is a civilian function. At which point, the consolidation of government is the disbarring or the act of sedition of the function of forming the government. At which point, it is terrorism for voter fraud, which compounds in all kinds of hate crimes, which has historically been trained in the Nazis from Germany, who, getting assistance from the socialists, immediately killed them once they were no longer useful. It's essential to understand the function of Satan in heaven and its comparison to the Confederate deep state inside the United States, such as the FBI, CIA, and others. At which point, the use of corrupting the military in order to overthrow the government was an active reenactment of the attempted coup in heaven. Now, whereas heaven had gone, the United States did not have gone. It hardly had any Christians, at which point, without the capacity to engage in any absolute moral position of any reliable competence, then there was no resistance capable to have stopped the mindless insurrectionists loyal to the terrorist tyranny, uh, at which point the system systematically collapsed onto itself against the United States, at which point morality became anti-morality, and anti-morality became morality. And the function of the argument of Satan from the record, many sources claim that he would have consistently, similar to Paradise Lost, claimed that God was tyrannical, that he has all of these rules, and that he's a fool, and he has no concept of being able to produce more information or intellectual knowledge in his refusal to continue to think past what he considers to be perfect in order to increase in the subversions and cons against the function of creation was unbearable tyranny. The function of perfect ordered society was considered rejectable tyranny. In the Satanist viewpoint, good is evil and evil is good, at which point the position of good as a form of tyranny becomes their status quo compulsion, at which point anyone who rejects their magic spell or seeks a recourse against their violation against the laws of nature would be considered evil. Anyone who tries to admit or provide evidence of their crimes against nature would be considered evil, would be considered punishable, at which point their core identity of being tyrannical, evil, trash pandas would actively seek to have recourse against evidence that they are, in fact, themselves in their entirety. And so the public being competently aware of them in context would be considered a punishable offense. And the Satanists want their Antichrist. The Satanists want their Satan. The Satanists want a one world totalitarian government with Satan in charge. And that required the breeding program. And the breeding program required a superior race, but they needed to stop that superior race from breeding, or else they would be replaced as the in control race. At which point they had to actively obstruct the superior race, had to block the indigos from being able to reproduce, at which point the Antichrist not being able to breed is functionally in line with the ritual. The Antichrist ritual, the forming of the one world Satan government, requires these practices, at which point the value being owed to the patriarchy, which would be the only ones who were competent enough to be owed the resources, would actively have to be in line with all of those systems, and the long-standing value owed to them would have had to have been blocked in order to show up all of a sudden instead of being a pre-established knowledge. So, like, if they targeted David and the Americans were in control, then the world would have known about David generations ahead. At which point, that isn't all of a sudden, then it doesn't matter. But the fact that he's owed all of that value And the fact that they could delay when it's submitted through their human trafficking makes it all of a sudden, which is their one of the essential bullet points of their ritual. At which point, this is a long-standing breeding program which has consolidated their objectives into this position as they funnel him into those obligations as they conduct their satanic rituals in their child sacrifice arrangement, which the entire justification is because they can. And because they can, they feel that they must. And because they must, that is the moral. And you are oppressive if you reject their tyranny. The record indicates that the West gave Stalin nuclear powers, at which point the understanding is that they crafted communism. The influence of the communists as a subject of those in the West from the white nationalist wizard organizations systematically is pre-writing and scripting the contents of history for the arrangements through the intelligence community, which requires the existence of David's intelligence oversight branch in order to stop, which makes David the highest threat to them. At which point, the highest threat to them being turned into their greatest weapon or asset makes the contest of compelling him into the ritual the primary interest, at which point they already have the base components, so long as the Americans are too inept and incompetent and pathetic and spineless and stupid little faggot little bitches to be able to do anything competent enough in order to survive as a collective society. At which point the assumption is that they, having created the communist functions, would have systematically created all of the communist functions, including the ones in China, including the ones in Vietnam, and the rest. At which point the evils of communists was a trick by the white nationalist wizards, generating the systemic destruction, getting them to kill themselves as a means of population control of groups that they are racist against, at which point getting them to kill themselves, getting them to call themselves, getting them to remove the races that they don't want to tolerate would be a systematic objective, at which point the creation of the spell automates the self-destruction button, dissolving them into nothing, at which point those afflicted with the spell of the white nationalists would be subject to being removed from history as the genocide is complete, requiring them to have automated their own death in a suicide bombing. But in summary, it's important to understand that the devil appreciates those who do not believe that he exists, just as much as he appreciates the wizards, at which point they're all damned the same. In any case, the traitor society, who says that they need to do whatever they need to in order to commit treason and overthrow the government elected by the people through voter fraud, have in fact consolidated the entirety of their collective identity as backstabbing traitors, and with that cannot be relied on anything. Their entire identity is to not be trustable.